Kia ora. Hello. Welcome to the latest episode of Medieval Sewing Made Easy, how to sew medieval fabric buttons. Today, I'd like to offer my method of sewing the round variety of these wonderful buttons which appear on fitted garments throughout the 14th century in Europe. I'll begin with making a button in a finished diameter of 11 millimeters, followed by a tiny button with a finished diameter of 6 to 8 millimeters, as seen in the book Textiles and Clothing 1150 to 1450. Firstly, you need to cut out a circle of fabric to make your button from, preferably with the same fabric as your garment. I've seen no evidence to support contrasting buttons in historical garments, but I do love surprises. It has taken me some trial and error to discover what size of cut circle I need to create what size of finished button. Today, I'm using a cut circle with diameter 27.5 millimeters to yield an 11 millimeter button. I will also be using a cut circle with a 14 millimeter diameter to make the really small buttons in lightweight fabric. I like to make a stiff paper template first, pin it to the fabric and cut around it. I can only guess at the medieval method of cutting. I imagine they might perhaps have used a circle of fabric as a pattern, but this is pure conjecture. Today I'm using pins and needles from our friends in Australia, Make Your Own Medieval, who have donated some to our channel as a giveaway for our viewers. Thank you, Make Your Own Medieval. These are the items here, and these are the ones here that I'm using today. I have a needle here and one of their pins. You can use these sort of ones, which are a 14th century replica, or you can use little snips like this. These ones are also from Make Your Own Medieval. They do some fantastic reproductions and medieval supplies. There we go, that's finished. Then you'll need to thread up your needle. I use a silk or linen thread depending on the status of the garment. High status or upper middle class, definitely silk thread. For middle class garments or for arming doublets, silk or linen thread. For a lower class garment, linen. I haven't tried wool, but I understand it was used to attach buttons on the Greenland garments, so it would be worth trying, definitely. Wool would be suitable for lower, middle and lower class impressions and would need to be strong thread with a high twist. The extant examples I have seen use a 2-ply silk thread, seemingly about the same thickness as a modern sewing thread, which I have here. I'm going to use the Gutermann silk sewing thread, colour 46. For a medium to large button, I use a doubled thread, about as long as my arm, with no knot tied in the end. See our previous videos, Medieval Sewing Made Easy, for directions on how to easily thread your needle. You can use some beeswax to just stabilise that thread if you want. Pass your needle through the circle of fabric, making a small running stitch around the outside at a consistent distance from the edge, say for example 3 to 6 millimeters. I'm using a medieval needle today for the sake of authenticity. You might want to do this in camp. Now as you do this, just leave a tail there. I like to make it about 1/3 of the total length of my thread. I've used thread about the length of my arm for this button, but if your button is smaller you won't need that much thread. If your button is larger you'll need a bit more thread. With trial and error you'll figure out how much you need. Continue around until the stitch line makes a complete circle. Ensure that your needle finally emerges at the same side of the fabric as it first entered, and this will be the right side of the fabric, or the outside of your button. So we want approximately 1/3 of the thread on this side and approximately 2/3 on this side with the needle on it. Leave the needle on the thread, then gather up the circle so it looks like a tiny little gathered pouch. Good job. Now comes the tricky part. I hold the two tails of thread in my left hand as the right-handed sewer, and with the needle or with a bone awl or something similar in my right hand, I begin to tuck the raw edges of the circle into the pouch that I've just made. You could also decide to just use your fingers. So sometimes I just fold it first, then pull the drawstring, and then tuck in the remaining ends. It's fiddly, it's frustrating. It's actually not in the analysis I've read by textile historians, but this is how the buttons appear to me to have been made. Now we've got all of those ends tucked in. Once this is done, have a look at your button. It should be kind of firm, looking like it might shape up to be about the right size. Pull that drawstring tight as you can without breaking that thread. Form it with your fingers. There you have a little round button. Now that's about the right size that I want, and I've discovered that through some trial and error. Now if it's not looking right, consider taking out the running stitch and starting again with the stitch line at a different distance from the cut edge. Alternatively, you can add a little stuffing if needed from the same fabric, small pieces of the same fabric. Another option is to trim down your fabric circle and start over. Now it's time to start stitching it closed. You could tie a knot at this stage in the two ends of the thread to help maintain tension on the drawstring, but I prefer to keep it loose so that as I stitch it closed, I can continue to tighten slightly. Keep your gripping hand firmly holding the button or your raw edges will probably escape. Make some stitches across the opening from one side to the other, crisscrossing and gradually making your way around the opening until you've caught each section of the opening. Tighten the thread as much as you can. Now this is a very dense broadcloth, so it's quite difficult to get the medieval needle through. Even though it's quite sharp, it's not as smooth as a modern steel needle. Okay, so I'm just coming to the last stitch around the button. I've secured all of the edges. Now I tighten the thread as much as I can. Now we can knot off the thread if we wanted to. Textiles and Clothing states that some of the buttons from medieval finds were also stitched right through, so top stitched. So now is a great time to do that. So take your needle and plunge it from the base of the button right through to the center of the top, like that. Once it has emerged, make a little stitch here in the top by passing it back through to the base of the button. There we go. So we've got a little stitch there at the top. Repeat this process now, making a group of stitches arranged around the top of the button, like petals of a flower. I like to do at least 5, but more is better, maybe more like 8 or 9. Don't make them too tight or you'll deform your button, and don't make them too small or you won't be able to see them. There we go. Now I've just peppered the top of the button with some little stitches. I sometimes like to knot off my thread at this point and either cut off my needle close to the end there and move on to making another button, or I leave the needle on and go straight to stitching this button onto a garment. If you opt to cut off the needle at this point, leave the long tails of thread so they can be used to sew the button onto a garment later. There are some excellent videos online about making this sort of button in different ways, which are at least as valid as mine, and they do it differently. They usually leave one tail of thread only. I leave two for one very specific reason, and that is when I'm attaching the button to the garment, I find that often if I only leave one tail to do the entire process, the thread tends to break because it's under a lot more stress. Whereas if you spread out the work between two tails of thread, they have far less stress on them and therefore break less frequently. One or two living historians I have spoken to have expressed doubt that the tiny 6 to 8 millimeter buttons seen in the book Textiles and Clothing are functional, or doubt that the photographs are indeed published at full size as stated. I personally have not seen firsthand the extant buttoned edges of garments from London. However, noting the large number of buttons on some 14th century effigies and the small size of certain other buttonhole fragments also found in London, I do not find it too difficult to believe. Although uncommon, buttons this size are still used in clothing today. I've made a couple of small buttons as close as possible to the ones from Textiles and Clothing, using two plain weave fabrics. One, a medium to lightweight pure wool flannel, and the other is a lightweight plain weave wool with a small amount of viscose added because that's all I could bring to hand. I've tried to match the thread count of the original fabric as closely as possible, although the thread count of these modern fabrics is not as high as the medieval one seems to be. Given the data on medieval thread counts for tabby woven wool fabrics, it would be expected to have medium to high thread count, being 10 to 25 threads per centimetre, as both the photograph and my sample fabric have, at approximately 19 to 25 and 15 to 17 threads per centimetre respectively. Here are the buttons that I was able to come up with. Using the same grey flannel, this is the second button that I made, and also now using a much smaller circle, this time approximately 14 millimeters wide, coming in at 7 millimeters wide. Now that's getting much closer. The photograph has buttons of 5 to 6 millimeters, so that was pretty good. My next attempt used the same template again, and this time using the very soft and lightweight wool, and this one came in at 5 to 6 millimeters, which was the same as the extant piece, and just using the same method that I showed you today. So it can be done. Whether or not it was practical, I don't know. This would be something that you could try for yourself. Well, you've reached the end of the video on making 14th century round fabric buttons. Next time on Medieval Sewing Made Easy, I'll show you how to attach them to a garment edge. Please see our video, Medieval Sewing Made Easy, How to Sew a Buttonhole, for help with making buttonholes to suit your 14th century garment. Remember to always make your buttonholes first. Thanks again to Make Your Own Medieval for their sewing tools featured today. We will be giving away a bundle of their sewing supplies when we reach 500 subscribers, so stay tuned for that. Check out the link in the description for the Make Your Own Medieval website. As always, please check out references in the description and feel free to leave comments and feedback. If you have experience and wisdom to share, please do. Oh, hey. I didn't see you there. I guess this means you must have enjoyed the video, so have fun, stay safe, and keep reenacting.